Welcome to meeting number 19 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So that you are aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. To ensure an orderly meeting, I'd like to outline a few of the following rules. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Please select the language that you would like to have interpretation from. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is in person in the committee room. Keep in mind directives from the Board of Internal Economy regarding masking and health protocols. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled by the Proceedings and Verification Officer. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. When you are not speaking, your microphone should be on mute. With regard to the speaker list, the committee clerk and I will do our best so we can maintain the order of speaking for all members, whether you are participating virtually or in person. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, the committee is meeting today to resume its study on the accessibility and affordability of telecommunications services in Canada. As is my normal practice, and for our witnesses, I will wave the yellow card for when you have 30 seconds remaining in your intervention. I will wave the red card for when your time is up. Please respect the time limits so that we can get as many questions from our members and responses from our witnesses. I'd like to now welcome our guests with us today. From Southwestern Integrated Fiber Technology, we have Barry Field, Executive Director. De Québécois, nous avons Pierre-Carl.
From Québécois, we have Pierre-Carl Pilado, the CEO of Vidéotron, and Jean-François Pruneau, President.
This is present for 7 minutes, and then we will go to rounds of questions. So we will start today with Mr. Field. You have the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chair and honorable committee members, my name is Barry Field. I'm the Executive Director of Southwestern Integrated Fiber Technology, commonly referred to as SWIFT. SWIFT is a nonprofit regional broadband program governed by the Western Ontario Wardens Caucus, the town of Caledon, Niagara Region, and Waterloo Region. SWIFT's mandate is to eliminate the digital divide within Southwestern Ontario, an area with a population of over 3.5 million people, representing 10% of Canada's population. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in your important deliberations regarding accessibility and affordability of telecommunications services. While accessibility and affordability are both important components of this discussion, my area of concentration is accessibility, and I'll focus my comments accordingly. SWIFT has recently committed the procurement phase of our first project called SWIFT 1.0. The project is funded by the governments of Canada and Ontario, each contributing $64 million, and through the over $20 million in contributions from our municipal members. SWIFT is grateful for these contributions and works diligently to ensure that these public funds are spent in the most effective, efficient, and equitable means possible. The primary goal of the SWIFT 1.0 project is to provide broadband services meeting or exceeding the CRTC's universal service objective to 50,000 underserved premises within the SWIFT catchment area on or before June of 2023. Secondary goals include ensuring 3,100 kilometers of new fiber construction and $65.5 million of private sector investment in the form of contributions from the Internet Service Providers, or ISPs. I'm excited to announce to you today that SWIFT has concluded the procurement phase of our project, has exceeded all of these targets, and is currently working with the ISPs to implement these important projects. The SWIFT 1.0 project has exceeded the premises target by 26%, the fiber construction target by 30%, and the private sector investment target by 93%. By all measures, this regional project has been an overwhelming success, yet a tremendous amount of work remains. Through the development and execution of the SWIFT 1.0 program, there are several lessons that we've learned, and I'd like to pass on to you today in hopes of influencing the design of future broadband strategies. First, one size does not fit all. There are geographic differences between regions in Canada, and they can't all be shoehorned into a single model. We need to consider differences in settlement patterns, availability of data, and existing broadband market dynamics, to name a few. In southwestern Ontario alone, there are major cities, towns, villages, hamlets, clustered seasonal shoreline development, and mass expanses of low-density agrarian settlement. The variability of settlement patterns in combination with existing market dynamics has a substantial impact on who provides existing services and how they expand those services. The variability in these dynamics increases as you zoom out to the national level. Secondly, all ISPs, regardless of their size, have a part to play in helping us solve this problem. In certain circumstances, the small ISPs are more willing and better suited to provide service to areas that larger ISPs are not. The proposed solution can't be designed to exclude the participation of small ISPs. Thirdly, all three levels of government must cooperate and work together to solve this problem. Competing programs at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels make it difficult for ISPs to access funding and does little to take advantage of opportunities to leverage contributions from all three levels of government. Within southwestern Ontario today, there are no less than 5 active government programs, all trying to solve the same problem in the same geography. The CRTC's Broadband Fund, the Connect to Innovate program, the Universal Broadband Fund, Ontario's ICON program, and the SWIFT program are all active. Combining the substantial contributions of all three levels of government would make it easier for the ISPs to participate and would leverage all of those funds into a single larger funding bucket. Fourthly, technology choices should be a regional consideration. Referring back to my first comment that one size does not fit all, differences across geographies must be taken into account when determining the best technologies to consider when funding projects. The variability of settlement patterns and market dynamics between regions will influence the feasibility of filling the gap with fiber versus wireless and low Earth orbit or LEO technologies. Finally, further funding is required by all levels of government. The combined contribution of all of the programs available today will not solve the problem. In southwestern Ontario alone, we require approximately $1 billion worth of investment above and beyond the current programs in order to reach the target of 95% of the population served by 2026. The current commitment from the federal government, while substantial, is simply not enough to solve the problem. Madam Chair, you've heard from other witnesses to this committee that Canada needs a coordinated broadband strategy. The current strategy, Canada's connectivity strategy, is well-intended and has solid elements. However, it's not being implemented in a coordinated manner to ensure effective, efficient, and equitable outcomes across the country. The existing federal approach of having multiple disjointed funding programs that are not aligned with provincial and municipal partners causes an overlap of responsibility, a duplication of effort on the part of the ISPs when applying for funding, and a duplication of administrative overhead. It risks different programs funding the same projects, and it distracts the federal government from what should be its central role of providing equitable distribution of funds. Like other infrastructure programs in Canada, funding for broadband programs should be transferred from the federal government to the provinces and territories, and they should be charged with coordinating contributions at the provincial and municipal levels in order to ensure that effective, efficient, and equitable solutions are being implemented in their jurisdictions. I thank you once again for the opportunity to speak here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Field. J'invite maintenant Québec.
We'd like to invite Québecor and Videotron to present. You have 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, as the chair mentioned, I'm Pierre-Carl Pelado. I'm President and CEO of Québecor, and I have here with me Jean-François Pruneau, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Videotron. I'd like to thank you for welcoming us here so we can present our situation. Québecor and its 10,000 employees have demonstrated over the years their firm and sustained commitment to Quebec's economic prosperity and the development of our regions. We have been doing this for decades, and obviously we wish to continue in the same vein. And as an illustration, I present the billions of dollars invested in our telecommunications networks. These have been able to provide the reliability and the robustness necessary to meet the growing demand for telecommunications that are related to the growing needs of telework, entertainment, and many other online activities related to the unfortunate situation that we're living here in Canada and in other countries of the COVID-19 pandemic. At a time when we were in the heart of a debate over the use of networks by zero-cost resellers, and we have to recognize that their contribution to the development is zero. So these resellers of wireline and wireless internet services, we must recognize the vital contribution that network builders make to the Canadian economy. Our investments are ongoing, and they show that the current regulatory approach of facilities-based competition is the right one. To propose to cut it up, as some would have it, could be detrimental to Canada's investments and to the continuation of a Canadian economic development and productivity. We will always support competition as long as it is fair, equitable, and beneficial to all stakeholders of an industry. And this is the case with Videotron's experience in wireless telephony, which was able to break the cartel of the three historic incumbent operators and which allowed Quebec consumers to benefit from the lowest prices, the lowest rates in Canada. In this regard, we would like to remind you that the Competition Bureau presented in November 2019 an unequivocal finding in regions where regional competitors with their own wireless facilities, such as Videotron, have achieved a market share exceeding 5.5%. The prices are 35% to 40% lower than in the rest of Canada. This observation was recently corroborated by the report published on January 29, 2021 by Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada on the evolution of wireless service prices, since it shows that Quebec is the only province in the country to have so far reached, for almost all targeted bundles, the objective of a 25% reduction set by the federal government at the end of 2019. This tour de force was made possible thanks to the customer experience offered by Videotron and the performance of its network, both of which have won numerous industry prizes. So in contrast to the interference from resellers, we must insist that their contribution to investment is nil. Videotron has invested more than $1.5 billion in the construction and the evolution of a network, as well as $1.2 billion for the acquisition of mobile frequencies, thus enriching the Canadian repertoire. We want to continue our investment so that even more Quebecers, particularly in the regions, can have access to high-speed internet at a fair price. Unfortunately, we are meeting up with opposition from Bell Canada, which is voluntarily hindering access to the support infrastructure, the poles, which it owns because of the monopolistic heritage of the past. We're not the only ones to say so, since Rogers, Cogeco, the Fédération québécoise des municipalités, Masquicom, as well as several other MRCs, municipal regional county municipalities, also have denounced Bell's actions. The effects of its anti-competitive behavior are particularly serious. If the federal government does not take the measures necessary to bring Bell back to order, the ambitious objectives of the new Universal Broadband Fund, which are to connect 98% of Canadians to high-speed internet by 2026 and the entire population by 2030, will remain unattainable, and the digital divide separating our fellow citizens living in rural areas from those living in urban areas will persist. It's important to emphasize that this anti-competitive behavior, constantly and frequently denounced, is not limited to access to the support infrastructure of this dominant national company. Far from it. Whether by turning a blind eye to satellite television piracy in the 2000s or by refusing TVA Sports equivalent treatment to RDS in its cable television packages, or even more recently by blocking by all means video's entry into Abitibi-Témiscamingue, Bell's all-out anti-competitive behavior is rooted in its business practices and stems from a monopolistic attitude that dates back for decades. So I understand that my time is up, Madam Chair, so we are available to answer your questions, and thank you for listening. Thank you very much. We'll start the round of questions.
Questions goes to MP Dreeshen. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you very much to everyone of being here today. The committee has heard a lot of testimony over the last year about some of the challenges that rural municipalities face in accessing adequate rural broadband services. And we've heard from many witnesses that the larger players are simply not interested in servicing communities since the profit margins are not high enough. And I just one comment I want to make, like today is Canada's Agriculture Day. When you mentioned, Mr. Field, the low density agrarian settlements, I guess that's us as farmers. Because we certainly feel as though we're missing out in so many different ways. And I know there's a lady that had spoken at the Status of Women Committee on issues of connectivity in rural areas of Canada, Adrienne Ivey, and a lady that I know that has worked very hard on ag issues, Sherilyn Nagel, had just commented that my career has been heavily affected by the poor internet connectivity, and the idea that my kids would ever have to do school online gives me the shivers. So I think that's really what we're looking at right now, and that's why we're concerned about the plans. And I believe, Mr. Field, you outlined some of those issues and the fact that the red tape that's associated with this certainly needs to be dealt with. We've heard from some of the regional ISPs that are interested in providing service to rural areas that they face challenges in getting reasonably priced access ratios onto the backbone networks. And and we've heard from municipalities that we really need to have some type of comprehensive plan. So I'm just wondering if you could flesh out some of those 5 points that you had before to talk about how we can make sure that governments are working together, that they're working with companies, and that we really do get something out into the rural and remote parts of this country.
Thank you, sir. And absolutely, I'd love to talk about that. First and foremost, one of the main points I made is that we've got these different buckets of funding, all trying to solve the same problem. I think if we step back and were to design a program from scratch as to how to fund broadband in mainly in rural regions of Canada, we would not develop the current system that we have, right? It doesn't make sense in a lot of cases, and it's not the most efficient system. I think what we need to do is to collaborate. The federal, the provincial, and the municipal governments need to collaborate. And I really believe that the funding, like other infrastructure projects in Canada, this is no different. The funding should be transferred from the federal government, getting it as close to the communities as possible through the provinces. Let them decide how to actually execute the programs in their provinces. Having said that, it is vitally important that we have participation from all levels, all sizes of ISPs. In the SWIFT program alone, it's interesting to note that we've awarded about 20% of our funding to the national carriers. That's a small amount of our funding. So 20% went to the national carriers. 25% went to what we call the medium kind of regional types of carriers, such as Cogeco, for example. And then the remaining 55% went to small ISPs. I'm sure you've never heard of some of these ISPs. The third largest recipient of SWIFT funding is a small company out of Holstein, Ontario, called ATEL Communications, or ATEL Networks, rather. I suspect most people on this committee have never heard of them. I didn't hear about them before I started this role either. They're a very small ISP, but they're willing to stand up, like many of the other small ISPs. They're willing to stand up and provide service in areas where there is no business case necessarily for the larger incumbents to do that. And I think it's a mistake to look down upon the larger ISPs. They're businesses. They're profit-driven businesses, and that's okay. What we need to do is develop programs that allow them to continue to do what they do, but do it in lower dense areas.
Thank you. And I'm interested in another aspect of how the government process works, because I understand at the end of 2019, your organization filed an application to appeal what you refer to as the restrictive eligibility criteria currently used to determine access to federal broadband funding. So, and I believe you requested that changes be made to the exclusive use of the system used by Innovation Science and Economic Canada to map served and underserved areas as the base for CRTC funding eligibility. Can you explain what the issue was there and how you've been able to try to resolve that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would first comment that understanding the map, so understanding where service exists today and where it doesn't exist today, is probably half of the challenge. It's extremely difficult work. There are many players providing services across the country, and to understand exactly who provides what and where is a challenge for any organization to do. The situation that you refer to, I think for the most part has been resolved. At the time, the CRTC and ISED were using the hexagons in their mapping system to determine which areas would be funded and which will not. Effectively, what that meant was if there was a single household within a 25 square kilometer hexagon that received 5010 services, that entire hexagon was not eligible. They've since.
Unfortunately, Mr. Field, sorry, we're out of time. We're over time on that slot. Perhaps you can pick it up on another round. Our next round of questions goes to MP Jacek. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. Certainly, from what you've said, it definitely echoes what we've heard from other witnesses in terms of jurisdictional areas, funding from 3 levels of government, and certainly, just as a local MP, I have found it extremely challenging knowing where various ratepayers groups should apply, in fact, for funding. So, Mr. Field, if you could just elaborate a little bit more. I mean, you're talking about a transfer of funds from the federal level to the provincial level that would then work with municipalities. I think, as we all know, that with COVID-19, the issue of broadband access really does have a national imperative or responsibility to a certain extent. So there has been a recommendation of a broadband czar at the federal level, as an example, to try and coordinate, at least at the federal level, what exactly is required in terms of access and affordability for internet services across the country. How do you actually see your model in operational terms? How exactly would it work when you say the three levels need to collaborate, knowing full well that that often doesn't happen?
Thank you for the question. So first and foremost, I think by transferring funds from the federal government to the provincial and municipal governments doesn't necessarily take away the role of the federal government. I mean, I think coordination is absolutely key to make sure that there is a coordinated plan across the country. The existing SWIFT project right now is an example of that funding regime that I talked about. We are funded effectively in equal parts by the federal and the provincial government. The federal government, through Infrastructure Canada, provides funds to the federal government. The provincial government. The provincial government has a contribution agreement with SWIFT, and they disperse the federal and the provincial funds to us. In addition to that, the municipalities, the member municipalities of SWIFT have made a contribution in excess of $20 million, and that continues to grow, by the way, to the program. So effectively, they're all working together in that regime to provide funding down to the regional level. Not in every case, I'm sure it doesn't make sense to do regional projects. In Southwestern Ontario, absolutely it does. We've shown that it can be effective. We have EORN in Eastern Ontario that is they have a regional project as well that's equally effective. So I think in certain circumstances there are benefits to pushing that money down to the regional programs.
The federal government recently introduced a Pathfinder program that was designed to assist applicants. Have you had any experience with that, and can you tell us what you think of it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the Pathfinder program is a program that's attached to the Universal Broadband Fund, and it's I think they call it a concierge service that allows the ISPs when they're applying for funding through the UBF, to call up and have somebody to talk to walk them through various issues they may be having, and that certainly works well within the UBF fund. I'm currently working with Peely Island here in Southwestern Ontario to put an application into the UBF fund, and we've used that service, and it's effective. I think, though, we're talking at a higher level as to how we coordinate all of the various funds, all of the various monies that are out there into something that's more efficient.
In other words, it would cover each of the various funds. In other words, the rapid response stream and these other buckets of funding. It should be coordinated across all of those.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, Mr. Field, you did emphasize that you were talking about accessibility, but as you know, this study is to explore affordability as well. And it strikes me that you are somewhat objective on the affordability issue. So do you have any comments in terms of what the federal government might do to improve affordability? We've heard about the Connecting Families program. Any insights from the work you've been doing in Southwestern Ontario?
Yeah, so again, my forte is more on the accessibility side, but I do have some opinions. So I think first and foremost, by giving people access to networks, you are effectively handling part of the affordability issue. Right now, we hear from families in Southwestern Ontario all the time that have 2 or 3 different cell phone plans because they have to tether their computer to a cell phone to get their broadband. It's not uncommon for me to hear from people that are spending $700, $800, $900, up to $1,000 a month just on their cellular bill because of this issue. So I think by solving the accessibility issue, you are in fact helping to solve some of the affordability. I do think competition is a good thing in driving down prices. most of the funding that's out there today requires open access, and I think that open access to networks that are funded by the various levels of government is important, and it needs to be done in a fair and transparent way.
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Field.
Thank you. Notre prochain tour, c'est
Merci. Now it's Deputy Lemire's turn, and he has 6 minutes. You're on mute. Yeah, we never get used to this. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Chair for planning this meeting. I think that what we're hearing today is very important. So thank you, Mr. Field, and thank you, Mr. Pelado. My question goes to Mr. Pelado. What are the main obstacles that you're getting, that Videotron is facing to make his services more available and to make them more affordable? Thank you, Mr. Lemire. I mentioned it in my remarks. We are facing obstacles. We have been facing obstacles for decades. Québécois bought Videotron in 2000, and sometimes we have to. Sometimes there is a founder, and that founder becomes the owner of a monopoly, and sometimes that owner does not want to relinquish its dominance. However, we can try to get more space through all means necessary. The obstacle that we are facing, that we have faced over the past few years, is the following. Videotron has had issues widening our networks. We wanted to widen our networks to give high-quality service, high-quality internet service. But obviously, the surface area where Videotron operates is important. We work in Montreal, in Quebec, in Chicoutimi, in Sherbrooke. We are in all of these regions, and there is a high enough population density. So we were able to make major investments in these regions. But when we get away from these areas and when we go to the regions, internet in the regions is not just about places like Chibougamau. Sometimes it's the South Shore or the North Shore. We can live within 45 minutes of an urban center and not have access to high-speed internet. Why? Because the infrastructure does not belong to us. In Quebec, there are two main owners, Hydro-Québec and Bell Canada. Mr. Pelado, if you'll allow me, according to a QMI journal article, they say that the fight for infrastructure is over. What do you think about that? Well, I will use a popular expression. We'll see. We see that a statement was made, but we don't immediately believe these statements. Procedures are very complex, processes are very long, and unfortunately, people are using all possible means to prevent us from accessing infrastructure and poles. The Premier of Quebec spoke in the Blue Chamber at the National Assembly, and he called on Bell's, and he spoke to Bell's CEO. That rarely happens. CEOs are rarely called on by parliamentarians. So that statement, has it led to an evolution on Bell's side? We hope so. But so far, I think it is premature to think that the war is over. We are going to keep fighting to widen access to broadband internet. We are going to fight for better access for Quebecers. And we have been fighting for that for years, and we will keep fighting for it. If there are no penalties, and if Bell is king in that area, who has the power to tell them otherwise, and who can tell them to give more access to competitors? It doesn't really work. Bell Canada has always worked that way, and unfortunately, Their culture and their mentality is all about monopoly. It is deeply entrenched in their culture, and I think it is too soon to say that things will change. Mr. Pilado, I am the MP for Abitibi-Témiscamingue, and we are 75% of my region. Can you tell us about how Bell has tried to stop modernizing and widening the network in my region to the detriment of families and companies? And how can the federal government improve competition for telecommunications in Canada? I am very happy to answer this question, and I'm going to ask my colleague Jean-François to add to my answer. So this is my answer so far. Mr. Lemire, you know that Bell Canada has a monopoly. Bell bought Cablevision, and they are also the owners of Télébec. So they control cable and access to internet as well as phone lines. They also own wireless phone lines. Jean-François can give you a more precise answer, but we have been asking for alternative services for over a year now. We wanted to give other options to people in Abitibi. We wanted them to have more options, but unfortunately, we were hit with a barrier of opposition. They were trying to stop us. They did everything they could to slow us down, and every time we received permission to build infrastructure, we did not receive permission to build them. So maybe Jean-François can give you a few examples. Mr. Pilado, you are now out of time. We didn't want to cut your time, but you're out of time. I just want to add something. Ever since access to polls was, ever since poll access was regulated, my personal internet connection got better.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Start with Mr. Palado. What's Videotron's position on the recent CRTC decisions? Do you think that that's been something that is advanced competition, or has it limited competition?
Thanks for the question. I guess that, the important point is, it shows, throughout the pandemic that Canada's been living. There was no such a telecom company that was not able, to offer a decent and robust service. And this was very important for every people living in Canada, but also for the companies, and something of importance also, because in this digital economy, productivity through the usage of network is of great importance. So as we say, the proof of the pudding is the eating. We've been there, we've been delivering, quality service, and there were no such a thing like disruption that we would expect. So it shows that, the telecom companies, about what we call, network base, had been there to deliver. What we call, the TPIA, so the third party internet service or resellers are offering, is the uses of that network that had been, highly invested to be able to cover without having the proper investment. And this is such a system that at the end of the day is basically stopping the proper interest and the intention for telecom companies to continue to invest and to continue to make sure that all Canadians will be able to benefit from the best internet service and the best telecommunication as a whole, because it's not only on the wireline internet, but is also on the wireless side.
So in general, you don't believe then that the CRTC's decisions have been consistent to increase competition then? Is that, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think the question is whether or not, without putting it on a spot, is just quite frankly this, is that, do we need more government direction than just relying on the CRTC for direction to increase competition? And if you could be real quick, I'd appreciate it, because I have a question to Mr. Field.
Okay, good. Well, I'll try to use an example. Is that, they were a cartel in the telecom business. They had 3 operators, and a former minister Prentice, which was a minister at that time, decided that there will be competition. They set aside spectrum. From there, you've been seeing other telecom companies being wireless operators. And what the result of all this is, despite the fact that, that was a significant investment, well, I guess I should not say despite, because of the investment, then the prices went down and competition came. But it comes because it was investment, and it comes also with the fact that the companies paid significant amount of money for buying and licensing the spectrum. So at the end of the day, what I see is that, yes, you need to make sure that there will be competition, but fair and equitable competition with what we believe is facility-based operators, which is not what resellers are proposing.
Okay, thank you. And I'll move to Mr. Field. And I just want to acknowledge again that the spectrum situation has brought in $22 to $26 billion of revenue for the government without, a model that is workable, in my opinion. But at any rate, Mr. Field, I want to go back to your testimony, if I could. A little bit concerned with regards to, how do we create national expectations and support for broadband if we devolve everything to the provinces alone? So I hear your concerns with regards to the equity and getting across the different areas, and SWIFT has been very unique in many respects, doing a lot of really good work for many things. But how do we guarantee a model that will be more pan Canada? Like, a real quick example here in Windsor, Ontario, we finished the 401. 17 kilometers before the actual border crossing. So for the years, a provincial interconnected road connected 40,000 vehicles per day to the border crossings, which created a giant logjam in traffic lights and so forth. And so it led to massive problems and billions of investment later. How do we ensure that there's going to be a pan-Canadian support or principles if we just devolve everything mostly to the provinces?
Well, again, I go back to the comments about actually having coordination from the federal government. I mean, I think it's appropriate for them to coordinate, for them to provide their requirements if they're going to provide funding, what their requirements are, what the outcomes that they expect with their dollar are, what they are focused on, and what their priorities are. And I think it's completely appropriate for that to happen. And by the way, that happened with the SWIFT project as an example, right? The federal government said we want to make sure that we're connecting at least 300 named communities in the SWIFT program, and that was a requirement that they put into their funding of it. So there are ways for the federal government to ensure that their requirements are passed down to the province and passed down to the municipalities.
Okay, so I only have a couple minutes here, and then I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I'll be leaving the meeting to go to Justice Committee. So you're Mr. Field, I guess you'd be looking at outcomes and almost baking in like an RFP proposal for conditions and terms that could be measurable later on for the allocation of those fundings, and then consequences if they don't follow through with those measurables later on. Is that correct, or is that an oversimplification?
It's simplified, but it's correct. I think through the competitive nature of the RFP process that SWIFT is implemented, we've gotten better outcomes. We've gotten much more contribution from the private sector than we anticipated, and we contract with those ISPs to make sure that they're actually delivering what they said they could. And sorry.
So my apologies, you're a little over time. Thank you very much. We'll now start our second round of questions, and I'd really like to be able to give everyone a shot to have their questions in. So if you could please monitor the cards, please. Well, our next round of questions goes to MP Baldinelli. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing. I just want to follow up on that conversation that was just taking place between my colleague and Mr. Field, and that notion of the role of the federal government, and the issue of coordination and the important coordination role. But there's also, in my opinion, that whole discussion of the equity on federal funding that's provided. As we discussed with SWIFT being here, Southwestern Ontario makes up about 10% of the underserviced population, yet it's has received no funding through the Connect to Innovate program, and there's a great fear that the Universal Broadband Fund will do the same. So for that underserviced population, that's a great concern, and that's an important role for the federal government, not only in coordination and priorities, but in funding. Our region of Niagara participates in this SWIFT model, and I would suggest that the model, which utilizes a regional multi-government approach, has been tremendously successful. And Mr. Field, would you say that model brings out and fosters participation from the ISPs to service these low-density areas and communities? In fact, I think under your first tier, you actually got enhanced funding from the internet service providers. And so can you describe that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our first project, we nearly doubled. Effectively, we've doubled what we anticipated to get from the private sector or the ISPs. We've done that through the competitive nature of the program. We've allowed the big players, the Bells and the Rogers, to compete on equal footing with the very, very small players, companies you've never heard of. Sorry?
Go ahead.
So companies, some of the very, very small localized companies in southwestern Ontario, we allow them to compete on equal footing. We don't favor the large ISPs. When we do our evaluation criteria, which is extremely transparent, by the way, the ISPs putting in an application to the SWIFT program know their score by the time they put in their application, and they can compare that to the outcomes when the projects are announced. So by allowing that competition between the small and the large players, we've been able to make it a very competitive environment.
And thank you. And given the uniqueness of SWIFT as a model, I mean, it is one of the most efficient, cost-effective ways to deliver broadband infrastructure projects over a large geographic area. And would you suggest that it is a model to emulate?
I think, like all models, there's probably aspects of it that could be emulated and could be used elsewhere. But I go back to one of my comments in my earlier today. It's not one size fits all. What works in southwestern Ontario may not work in northern Ontario. The settlement patterns alone in northern Ontario are vastly different from southwestern Ontario. So there are aspects of different models that may work, including the SWIFT model. Some of those aspects could be transferred to other regions, but it's not necessarily that we could just carbon copy the SWIFT model and it would work everywhere.
Thank you. And it's never been more evident than during this pandemic about the increased, services are required in demand from members of the public for internet access. And so you had talked about now moving forward with a SWIFT 2.0 giga project. And can you provide a little bit more detail on some of that and what your plans and hopes are for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've put in a proposal to both the federal and the provincial governments here in Ontario to fund what we call the SWIFT 2.0 project, or a Giga project. And the goal of that program is to provide gigabit services to 95% of the population in southwestern Ontario within the SWIFT region. It's quite an expensive endeavor, of course, but we think it's well worth it. The key principle behind the Giga project is that we believe in providing services, fiber-based services to 95% of the population. You actually disperse fiber out into the rural areas down to the level where the wireless providers and other providers, given that it's open access architecture, they can actually grab onto the network and extend it to that last 5%. You may find that you don't actually have to invest in that last 5% if you can actually get the fiber far enough out into the low density rural areas.
And have you quickly approached the federal government yet to discuss funding for that project moving forward?
Yes, we have. We've put an application or not an application, but a proposal into both ISED and to the provincial government, and we hope that we get funded for it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Johari. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. It's been quite informative. Mr. Field, if I may come back to you. And you indicated as second in your opening remark, as the second part of your comments, that all ISP providers have to be part of the play. And you talked about, if my notes and my memory holds correct, that you had allocated 20% to the larger, 25% to the regional, and about 55% to the much smaller local ISP providers. And what criteria did you use to make that allocation?
So there wasn't a predefined allocation. That's just the way it worked out. And what that shows me is that the smaller players really stepped up to the plate and really put very competitive proposals into the program. Now, doing it this way, it's a lot of work. It's much easier, quite frankly, just to give your money to one company and let them go away and try to solve the problem. But it's not as efficient. I think by allowing that competition, by allowing the smaller players to participate in the program, we've actually gotten better outcomes, and we've certainly gotten more contribution from the private sector.
Okay, so it's fair to say that it was an open process, and then you allowed it, and the way it, as the dice rolled, the way it landed was 20%, 25%, or 55%.
Exactly.
Okay, so what this signifies to me that the smaller ISP providers are really stepping up, and you highlighted that in your comments. That's about twice as much as the others. Now, you also brought the concept of settlement pattern into, and in your previous comment, you mentioned that this model might not apply into all regions because the settlement pattern is almost like a regional level. So as we get further north, where there is much harder and there's a smaller business case or not as strong as a business case for us to be able to get the fiber backbone, what type of approach do you suggest? Do you suggest still the model that you've suggested here, the open source? Will that help? And you also talked about the technology pieces on your third element. That hey, look, technology was on your fourth element. That you said all the technology might be varying depending on the region you go. Can you make a comment of the applicability of this model as a strategy as we get northern part and a more remote and separated areas?
Absolutely, I can comment on them. I will state that my knowledge base is Southwestern Ontario, so I know Southwestern Ontario settlement patterns well, not so much the rest of Canada, and that's part of the part of my argument here is that the regional knowledge of what exists regionally and what's needed regionally is stronger than at a national level. But I think, if you're talking about the SWIFT model and its applicability to other regions, again, I think there are elements of the SWIFT model that could be applied to other jurisdictions. On the technology piece, that really goes to the heart of what I'm talking about. You can't say that, there's a mix of 80% fiber and 20% wireless in one region, therefore it's applicable across the country. You've got to look at the specific nature of the region and develop a technology approach that makes sense for that region. In Northern Ontario, I'm speculating here, but maybe that mix of wireless might need to be higher or lower depending on the situation. But the point being is that the regional companies, the regional municipalities there know better what their needs are than I do sitting in Southwestern Ontario.
Thank you. I got about 45 seconds, and I want to go to affordability. I do acknowledge that you said accessibility in that region is the area your focus. Can you share with us how affordability is being considered as part of the solution? Not only accessibility, because I'm sure that cost plays a big role in for the end consumer. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So within the SWIFT program, we do touch on affordability a little bit. I'm very aware that I am not a regulator and I've got no authority to be a regulator, but we do have a contract with the ISPs for a period of 7 years after they implement the network. And what we mandate in that contract is that they actually offer a 50/10 package at a rate no more than, I believe it's $115. Don't quote me on that. It's very close to that. $115 per
Thank
month.
you very much, Mr. Field. My apologies.
No problem.
Our next round of questions goes to Député Lemire. Vous avez 2 minutes.
You have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Pelado. You have mentioned obstruction from Bell. What the federal and provincial government are being blocked, and the old measures are still favoring the old big companies. Can the federal and provincial government do anything to reduce that monopoly? Yes, Mr. Lemire, you are right. The government of Quebec has publicly called out Bell, but they don't have much power because this is under federal jurisdiction. This means that the CRTC or the Department of Industry would be responsible. They would be the ones who would need to meet with Bell, and they would have the regulatory power to force Bell to ensure that we can have better competition. I answered your colleague earlier, and I talked about the GPIAs. So yes, the CRTC has regulatory power, but they need to have the courage to use that power. I think that we've seen the proof. Competition decreases costs for consumers. If we want to give consumers more options and if we want to have competition, without competition, prices will keep rising and quality won't really improve. Yes, Bell owns the infrastructure, but us in Quebec, we have had the chance to compare the situation because the poles belong to two companies, Hydro-Québec and Bell Canada. Why is it that we have nearly zero issues with Hydro-Québec? Hydro-Québec is not in competition. Their job is to sell electricity, but we constantly get refusals from Bell Canada, and Bell Canada is a competitor, and they would rather sell their own services, even though they are always late, and they don't want our investments to come to fruition, and consumers are the ones who are paying the price. I have one last question. There are federal level programs from the CRTC and from the Department of Industry. There are other programs for Indigenous groups, and we have programs for provinces. Wouldn't it be easier if the federal gave money to companies like yours? I think Mr. Field answered that question. I think that if we have a single authority, it would be easier and more efficient. When we have multiple players, it complicates matters and it slows the implementation down. Thank you. Now, Member Boulris has the floor for 2.5 minutes. Welcome. Thank you, Madam Chair. I am very happy to join you today. Mr. Pelado, I am going to continue with you. First, I am a proud client of your new product, Helix, so I'm sure you'll be happy to hear that. You said that having more competition will lead to a reduction of costs. But for cell phones, I don't think that Canadians and Quebecers are well served by the competition that I believe was opened by the Conservatives. Now let's talk about high-speed internet access. In some regions in Quebec, and some of my colleagues mentioned it earlier, with the pandemic and teleworking, accessing high-speed internet should be an obligation. It would be a public service, right? What we've seen is that everything that's been tried in the past few years didn't work. There are areas where people don't have access to high-speed internet. So are we still doing what we've been doing for the past 15 years? Or are we going to try harder to serve people? First, Member Boulris, thank you for your loyalty and thank you for trusting us. You've probably noticed that the Helix service works great. It has vocal recognition. I also use it at home, and I love it. You just talked about internet access, but there is another aspect. Telecommunication companies also have to deliver the service. You probably know that the funds that we get from these programs also help us to develop television programs later. So if companies have a wider footprint, it changes the cultural footprint. So if we don't have a lot of money coming in, our cultural productions will also die off. We need to keep working to widen our service offerings. Sometimes services are more expensive, but we are doing everything in our power to decrease costs.
Nous allons continuer à déployer, et ça aussi, c'est important de mentionner que
current customers don't want to spend too much, but they still want more speed, and they want higher speed. So we keep working, keeping all of that in mind. Thank you. Now, Member Généreux has the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize to the interpreters because I have to use my earphones. I had to switch to my iPad. Mr. Pelado, thank you for your presence. When Bell found out about the CRTC's decision to cap internet costs, they said that they were going to reduce their investments by 20% in rural areas. You know that in my area, we are partially served by Bell. So did you also decide to reduce your service offerings when you found out about the CRTC's decision? Mr. Généreux, you are right. I talked about that problem. I talked about resellers earlier. Quebec and Canada have had a system, a high-quality telecommunications system, and I think that it's very important for our companies to be productive. We need to have more services in the regions, and you were also right to say that Videotron is one of the providers in your region. We want to keep serving people in this region. Our investments have started, and we will keep investing in your region. If we have to compete with resellers who behave like leeches and use existing infrastructure, we will not be able to give high-quality service to residents and companies. Mr. Pelado, my apologies. So what you're saying is that the resellers are like parasites, but I wouldn't call them parasites myself. But resellers don't invest in infrastructure. That's not their core business. That's what you're saying. So the fact that they're not investing in infrastructure is penalizing your company because you are investing a lot in infrastructure. That's what you're saying, right? Well, the government also asked that same question. They wondered whether the decision was good. They wondered whether the CRTC used the right tools to come to that decision. What we're trying to say is that we don't necessarily disagree with the existence of resellers, but conditions for resellers need to be fair for us and for everyone. Unfortunately, the CRTC's decision did not meet these conditions. Also, some of the conditions do not apply to resellers. I think the government eventually realized that they need to think about things differently so that we can have competition, but competition should not penalize investors and development that will help citizens get the best service quality possible. All right. Well, think about my region. We have 58 municipalities in my riding, and some of them get their services from Videotron. But let's say that in some of these municipalities, we are in some very large areas. So how much does it take per capita to have how much does it have to cost for it to make sense financially for you to agree to serve these people with Vidéotron? Well, the very first thing is access to infrastructure. Once again, we get refusals because the infrastructure belongs to Bell. Second, you've mentioned that a bit earlier, some programs exist. The federal government has a program, the province of Quebec has a program, and we are working with them to try to serve as many people as possible. So when people are further from the service centers, it will be more expensive to get the fiber all the way to these people. We want to reach a balance. We want the government to help, but we also want companies to be able to give a good service. So that balance between the two, these are the things that we are discussing. Mr. Field also mentioned it earlier. We had the RFPs and the conditions for them. We want the RFPs to make sure that people will be able to get the service they want. We want the regions to be connected. Thank you. Next question goes to Member Lambropoulos. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would like to thank all of our witnesses. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for answering our questions. Mr. Pelado, my first question goes to you. I think that Mr. Lemire has already touched on it, but if you have something else to add, you're welcome to do so. You've talked about competition, you've talked about the importance of having competition, and you've said that Bell is often blocked when they request access in some regions in Quebec. My question is the following. What can the federal government do to help you access the infrastructure to widen your service offering in Quebec? I know that you've partially answered the question, but do you have something else to add before I move on to the next point? Well, I'm going to have to repeat that. The CRTC has tools. They are able to call witnesses. They can therefore talk about the problematic situation that we are currently facing. So far, the CRTC has not used that tool, but we are seeing that there's more pressure. And it's not just Vidéotron who is experiencing this. There are multiple other operators like Cogeco. There's Matricon. So there are co-ops as well. So they're all facing the very same obstacles.
And that's why I think the CRTC should really take responsibility and convene Bell and take the means necessary to be able to have competition happen to the benefit of Québécois and of Canadians. So given that we're in a pandemic now and people are much more dependent on the internet, on their cell phones, and good connection with a home, did you take any measures to make this more affordable for Quebecers and Canadians during this pandemic period? Well, I will ask Jean-François, because there are many measures that were taken by Vidéotron. Thank you for the question. Well, yes, several measures were put in place to care for our clients. For our wire telephones, we removed the limit on the internet service. So even if they had a maximum, they were able to profit from the internet connection with no limit. In the wireless side, we also removed those caps on data, and we also removed rates on roaming, and also some rates for long-distance calls. So several measures were put in place for our clients. And you have to understand that we have a second service that was launched a year and a half, 2 years ago, which is Fizz. It's a much lower cost service, and it was used a lot by our clients during pandemic. It's a digital service, so our cost is lower, and so we can decrease our rates for our customers. I know that there's a federal program to better connect Canadians who have this need. Are you participating in this program? Is Videotron or your other companies, do they use this program to provide better services to those who are in need? Yes, thank you for this question. We do participate in the program. So we have a 10 megabit per second internet connection with a limit of 100 gigs. And the rate is $10 or $19, the interpreter didn't hear. And what is your opinion on the smaller ISPs, smaller than Bell and Videotron, those who don't have infrastructure capacity but can offer services to Quebecers and Canadians? In terms of competition, what's your perception of these smaller companies? Should we make it easier for them to offer services to Canadians? We have had the opportunity to answer this, but we can add that yes, we've always believed in competition. And we too were resellers in some way, because when there were wireless services, we used the Rogers network. So the department said that if you have a permit, you must use it. So you have to make sure that when a network is put in place, there's an important investment. Otherwise, it's just being free riders. So thank you very much.
Our witnesses today. So I'd like to thank everyone for being with us today. We're going to suspend, and then I'll ask the members of the INDU committee to join the in-camera portion of the meeting. Donc, merci beaucoup à nos témoins pour votre...
Thank you very much to the witnesses for your presence and your evidence today. It's highly appreciated.
Members, please disconnect from this Zoom and reconnect in the in-camera portion. Thank you very much. Merci.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci, Messieurs.